The Owl, Part 2 by Rennie Sparks. In 1970, at about the age of 5, I had a terrible nightmare. I was standing on top of World Trade Center Building 1, surrounded by flames and searing heat. I was with a group of adults in office clothes, and I myself was an adult woman with blonde hair and a shiny blue skirt suit. We were being pushed closer and closer to the edge of the building by the crowd behind us, all of us pushing to get away from the unbearable heat. And then I remember someone grabbing my hand as we fell with the crowd into the freezing wind just as the building collapsed and the great fire rose up and devoured us all. And that's when I woke up. I was still a 5-year-old kid, and it was still the 1970s. But I was no longer the same child. I awoke in such a deep, ever-present gloom that I am today, even 50 years later, still grappling with the terrible memory of someone else's horrible death in the sky. In fact, the memory of the dream was so terrible. I remember having out-of-body experiences for a while whenever it bubbled up to my mind. It was just so easy. I would simply close my eyes and imagine spinning upward in a great spiral away from the bad feelings, and then it would just happen. I would zoom up into the air above the trees and zoom away in great circles above the streets of my neighborhood for endless hours in utter delight, in which I wasn't even a person, I was just really the sky. And it never occurred to me that what I was doing was strange or impossible. And of course, when it finally did occur to me, I couldn't do it anymore. At about the age of 8, I remember thinking, oh well, I guess I've finally gotten too big to fly. I wish I could remember how to zoom away like that. I wish I could understand how I dreamed a stranger's awful death 30 years before it happened. And I wish, most of all, to explain to you, my friend, what all this has to do with owls. Science will tell you that owls are not occult in the least. Science will tell you that owls spend most of their time looking for mice to eat. So much so that when an owl follows you through the woods for an hour in pitch darkness, that owl is actually following a mouse you've unknowingly flushed from the underbrush with your Frankenstein gait. If an owl stares in a window at you for several hours one day, that owl is actually staring at its own reflection in the glass and wondering if this good-looking stranger knows where the tastiest mice are hiding. If an owl dives at your head and knocks you down a hill to your death, surely that owl was simply aiming at a mouse-shaped cowlick in the back of your hair. If an owl flies apace with your car and stares in the driver's side window with great silver eyes that never blink, and it's somehow matching the car's speed without moving its wings, you, sir, have a lot of mice riding on top of your car. In other words, none of the rational answers offered give us any inkling as to why we have been weirded out by owls ever since we started making cave art. Here are some hard facts. Owls cannot move their eyes, and so they must turn their head to change their view. They have an extra eyelid to pull down when attacking, and I know that owls, like most birds, produce tears similar to our own. I don't know if this proves that birds get sad, but I do know that birds tear up while sleeping, so much so that there are actually nocturnal moths that fly around and steal sips of these little salty beads. I wonder if birds cry the tears now that we will cry in a million years when only our deepest DNA remembers how we once thought we ruled the world. Of course, the question of who rules the world has many answers even now. If we could ask the insects or the trees or the earth itself, all of them might have different answers. Regardless, the owl's eyes are unlike other bird eyes and unlike our own. They are designed to see in what we would call pitch dark. Rather than mere eyeballs, owl eyes are enormous tubes that stretch far back behind their ears into the area where a lot of other animals store brains. Of course, the brainless octopus instantly camouflages its body to match the colors around it, perhaps because it has no brain, and each of his arms is able to think simultaneously. Don't discount owls. These birds are able to stalk their prey with precision and silence in a deep ultraviolet darkness that we can only barely imagine. We do have one thing in common with owls, though: our front staring hunter's eyes. Try to look a duck in the eye, and you will find it impossible. And maybe, as my friend Cameron suggests, that's the real reason why we're attracted to owls. They are one of the few birds we can actually look directly in the eyes and feel seen by. Owls, though, are looking into a world we are blind to. What if there are ultraviolet beacons shining all around us that we are simply too blind to see? There are humans who report seeing outside our usual spectrum. Some people see auras of color shining out around everything. On a gardening website, I found the idea that trees have auras too, but they are harder to see because they only extend a few inches beyond their bark, while human auras spread around us in rays that stretch up to 3 feet. What if we actually glow in the dark to the massive eyes of the owl? And what would it take for any of us to start seeing more deeply into the darkness right in front of us? We are surrounded, scientists insist, by vast amounts of energy and matter that we are just barely able to detect by their effect on the things we can see. We call them dark energy and matter, as if that explains anything about them. What if all around us there are ghosts and ghouls and we're just blind to it all? Maybe we should be thankful. When I visited my friend Eric in the hospital as cancer metastasized through his body, he kept forgetting he was on his deathbed. He would explain to weeping visitors that he was fine. He had simply sprained his back installing a water heater. And when he became so sick he could no longer open his eyes, he explained to visitors breezily that he'd just been out in the sun all day the day before and he was now resting his eyes. He slipped into a coma that way, still talking about how much work he was missing and how he'd be back on his feet in no time. What I mean to say by bringing up Eric is that while I'm convinced I not only dreamed a stranger's death 30 years before it happened, and that I also used to know how to fly outside of my body, I am well aware that these experiences might also be my brain just concocting stories to make sense of what it's feeling. When I woke up deeply depressed after my nightmare, it might not have been caused by the nightmare itself, but simply heralded by it, like a red flag being waved in the darkness, warning me something wasn't right. That awful dream didn't come without some context. I grew up on Long Island in New York, and I'd gone with my parents to eat at Windows on the World, the restaurant high on top of Tower 1. I remember how the building swayed while we plucked from the opulent buffet table, occasionally swaying so much that the crowded dining room would burst into excited gasps, and the waiters would run around telling us all it was no problem, the tower was designed to sway and everything was perfectly A-OK. Maybe I had dreamed another person's death years before it happened because it was so awful. It exploded outward somehow, not just in space, but in time. But maybe I was just a really imaginative and really sad little girl. The real reason none of us can completely comprehend the idea of Schrodinger's cat is that none of us really care about a theoretical cat in a box. Our brains aren't made to conceive of such things. Our brains want to be called back when the announcement is made whether the cat is dead or alive. Until then, we have nothing to think about. And yet Dr. Schrodinger, he insisted his paradox was the most accurate understanding of what is actually happening all the time, moment by moment, in each of our little streams of reality. He believed not only that consciousness was an energy that moved far beyond the confines of a single skull, but it is the very thing weaving in and out of cat and human, convincing each of us we are all alone at the center of the world. Instead of reckoning with the disturbing news that you may be just another example of a god playing with its toys, most of us would prefer to look away. Even the cat in the box must think along those lines. Yes, I will scratch all their eyes out the instant this box is open. But until then, I will nap. My long sadness, my endless grief over a horror that did not happen to me, it has uses. It has crisscrossed me with stab wounds that never heal, but it has opened me up to the wind. And so I think Leonard Cohen got it backwards. It's not the light we're fighting to keep out, it's the darkness. The great sea of energy that threatens to utterly obliterate our little light. And yet, shadows don't actually seek to destroy us. Just as the darkness of space does not destroy the light of the stars. In fact, it is the very darkness that enables us to see any starlight. But shadows can feel like devouring demons. And I knew I needed to get myself on some antidepressants when the very thought of tearing up a head of lettuce sent me into hours of tears. I can chop salad now on my best days. On my worst days, the greens wilt and rot in the fridge because I can't bear to look at their dying beauty. In between those two states is where I mostly live. But life moves like a seesaw, and sometimes the guy on the other end just jumps off, sending you plummeting. I want a life of no alarms and no surprises, but none of us get that life for very long. What I'm still grappling with is the notion that it may be our very worst moments where our lives receive the greatest gifts. In 1998, something awful happened to me. I fell down a flight of stairs and broke my wrist. But during this bad experience, I also experienced a state of timeless euphoria. The actual fall, as I remember it, was no fall at all. It was an easy glide, a graceful arc through the air, as if I were a winged creature utterly in control, and time stretched out so leisurely that I had time to think so many thoughts while I soared slowly downward. I remember feeling like I had oodles of time there in the air, as much time as I needed, really, to contemplate the coming impact with the stair landing below. I suspected the crash would kill me because I was diving head first through the air above the third-floor staircase, heading for a direct impact with the second-floor landing below. I knew that if I didn't want to feel the feeling of the impact with that stair landing, I could just fly away and be done with the whole thing. I remember thinking it over, and at last, after much deliberation, deciding yes, I would return to Earth. I remember sitting up feeling utterly elated. I could fly again. There was no pain or fear. I was full of this goofy euphoria, and it was a few seconds before I became aware that my left hand was hanging at a very odd angle. And that's when the pain set in, and it was bad, and it made me forget for a long time that I could fly. Later, I asked a friend who witnessed the accident, and he said nothing about what happened coincided with how I remembered it. In fact, I had tumbled down the staircase in a quick heap without ever being airborne, barely managed to stop myself from tumbling down another flight by jutting out my hand so that my entire weight fell on my wrist and it snapped. There's surely a dissociative state you can slip into during a traumatic moment. Some things really are too awful to reckon with straight on. But I'm left with the fact that while I tumbled down and broke my wrist in a moment of chaos, what I remember is flying like a swan in a moment so full of time and perspective that it felt realer than the real life that I crashed back into. I know with certainty that I took that flight, but I also know with certainty that I took that fall. It's crazy, yes, but in a weird, hopeful way. Breaking my wrist became a little lighthouse in my head, a kind of beacon, a place that I could go back to again and again to remind myself that life can suddenly, in the midst of horrible things, become miraculous. We all have our good memories that we return to again and again, little sparks that give us fuel to return to the here and now and face whatever is next. You will be surprised, though, my friend, when I tell you about the brightest lighthouse shining in my head. It's not the moment when I flew down the staircase. It's not even the old memories I have of being able to soar into the sky at will and actually sort of become the sky. It's not even the memory I have of being on so much LSD that I was able to stick my head right through the wall of a house and speak to a mushroom that had sprouted in the driveway. The actual experience that kind of broke me open, left me believing just about anything is possible. It was actually a pretty mundane affair, according to the only other witness to the event, my husband, Brett. Even all these years later, he will not be convinced anything paranormal happened, while I will not be dissuaded of the fact that I met my guardian angels in the fog one night in 1987. It was just before dawn in early September. It was the year before we got married, actually, and it was a hard year. I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, studying creative writing. Brett was back on Long Island finishing up his grad school program, and we were spending the first time apart from each other after being an inseparable couple for 2 years. And so it was a really romantic gesture when Brett called me and said he was going to drive the 16 hours between us so we could spend just a weekend together. It was 2 a.m. when Brett called again to say he was finally at the edge of town. And it was only then that I realized I didn't own a car, and I actually wasn't sure how to direct him to my house. This was a long time before cell phones and GPSs, and so my best bet, I figured, was to call a cab. The driver could lead me out to Brett, and then I'd reverse the route to get us back to my apartment in Brett's car. It didn't seem like it was going to be all that hard. It was a small college town with cornfields stretching out in all directions, and I happened to live only blocks from a giant stadium that had great glowing lights burning all night long. And the cab ride was only about 15 minutes long, so I knew it was going to be easy to drive us back. The truck stop was closed, but there was Brett, waiting out front by a phone booth, under a crown of streetlights and a swirl of autumn moths. I was so happy to see him when I first spotted him from the back seat of the cab, and that in itself was a little miracle, because I knew then that I really did love him. I remember he looked beautiful and exhausted, and I couldn't wait to get into his arms. He had on jeans with holes at the knees and a green and white jacket from a thrift store, and I remember he smelled like snow, even though he'd been in a car eating Slim Jims for 16 hours straight. And then I got behind the wheel of his car and headed us back towards the lights of town. I was 22 and I was going to be in bed with my boyfriend in minutes. Life was just wonderful. The highway was empty. It was about 3 a.m. and I was just driving us back to town, and we were talking and laughing. And then a fog started to descend around us, and I had to slow the car. The visibility kept getting worse and worse. I wasn't worried. I knew it was mostly cornfields around us, and I could still see the lights of town ahead of us through the fog. But the mist kept thickening, billowing around the headlights in thick gray snakes. I had to slow down again and click on the high beams and really concentrate to keep the car in its lane. So that's what I did. We stopped talking, and I concentrated, and I drove us through the fog in silence for what seemed like another half hour. And then it occurred to me that there were no lights ahead, and the road was bumpy and narrowing. That's when I realized we were no longer on the highway. I must have driven right past the entire town in the fog. We were on a country road. There were no lights ahead or behind us. I knew we had to turn around. I knew the town had to be behind us, but the road was narrow and edged in tall grass. There was no place to turn around, so finally I just decided to stop and make a U-turn. I braked, backed up a few feet towards the shoulder, thinking I'd just give myself an easier turn that way. I didn't give it a second's thought. I was backing up onto roadside we'd just driven, all of it empty and dark and edged in prairie grass. But somehow the car went back only a foot, where there should have been at least 3 feet, and suddenly dropped off into thin air. I can still remember the feel of that sickening fall and the thud scrape as the car's underbelly hit the ground a few feet beneath us. It made no sense, but somehow I had backed the car not a few feet towards the edge of the road I'd just driven, but off into some abyss. The back half of the car hung off the road now at such an angle that our front wheels were off the ground. I rolled down the window and listened to all the car wheels whirring helplessly when I pressed the gas. At best, we were hopelessly stuck. At worst, we were about to fall backwards off a cliff. And then before I could decide what to do, there was a loud bang on the back fender and men's voices calling out from the fog, "We got you! We got you!" I could vaguely see them coming into view through my side view mirror, the top half of two men in orange construction vests standing in the darkness beneath the back end of our car. "Go ahead, pull her forward." Another bang came on the back fender, and I hit the gas gently, and then I felt the back end of the car being lifted straight up, so that our front end came down finally, and at last the wheels hit the pavement and we could roll forward back onto the road. We were even facing the right direction. I could see ahead of us now the bright lights of Ann Arbor and the beacon of the stadium right there before us. Out my rearview mirror, I saw a hand wave, and then there was another bang on the fender, and the men retreated into the fog. I don't remember much of the drive home. I mostly remember we felt relieved and tired and glad to finally get to my apartment as the sun was coming up. And I don't think I thought much about that lucky break at all in the next 5 years. And then one day, not coincidentally around the time I was crying over lettuce leaves, I developed a kind of irrational conviction that those two men who had lifted our car out of that black ditch were my guardian angels. Before you repate me in a swirl of rainbow unicorns for even mentioning the idea of guardian angels, let me explain. For me, a belief in angels coincided, as it probably always should, an equal belief in demons. In fact, I was feeling like actual snake-like shadows, demon eels, were latched all down my spine, sucking the life from me. At least that was how I remember describing the situation to my psychiatrist when I met with him the first time. Also, there were 2 rooms in my house that felt so filled with the wailing of hungry ghosts that I could no longer enter them. I was deep into what my psychiatrist labeled a psychotic depression, a sadness so deep it was literally driving me insane. I felt, of course, weirdly proud of the diagnosis, but I was also thinking a lot about throwing myself onto the train tracks each morning on the way to work, so any way of feeling good about myself was a kind of progress. And then I suddenly remembered that night outside of Ann Arbor. To have a memory of that kind of spark in life gave me something to cling to in the present hell I was living in. And maybe good memories are just that, a way for your brain to heal itself. Just as bad memories may be the cries of a brain falling down into the pit. Each time you dry your leaky bucket up from that old well of thoughts, it may be your brain simply searching for images to match what you're feeling right now. We all know that memory is unreliable in many ways, but maybe the truth that we can rely on is that memory is always telling us an emotional truth, if not an actual truth. Memory is our brain saying, there, right there. That's when I felt that feeling I once felt. And maybe it's that simple. To feel better, just think of better things. And so maybe I saved myself from a suicidal psychosis with an equally psychotic belief in a miracle. Maybe the meds just started working, or both, but somehow I did survive. I suspect that just pondering the possibility of having a guardian angel is a glimmering kind of thought, can heal a kind of malignancy in the very fabric of your brain. Neuroplasticity, they're calling it lately. Each time you dive through your head towards a good memory, it makes that good pathway easier to find the next time, and the next time, and the next. The memory of my guardian angels, it became a glittery guide towards the direction of feeling better. It's certainly possible there was a work crew out that morning filling in a ditch in the dark behind a sea of prairie grass, but there were no orange cones or construction equipment or lights. I saw only darkness and fog and grass, and then the road was gone, and the men emerged from nowhere in these bright orange vests and yellow hats, and every other feature about them was completely indistinguishable in my mirror. I've asked Brett what he remembers of that night quite a few times over the years. He's always surprised I'm still thinking about it. You backed into a construction zone and the workmen lifted us out. There was nothing strange about it. And maybe it's just some kind of pride, some kind of stubbornness that keeps me insisting on divine intervention instead of admitting I screwed up. I can't shake the feeling that we crossed some kind of line when my car backed up off that Michigan road into the fog. What I think lately is that we're both right. What if what happened in that pre-dawn fog was utterly paranormal and utterly normal at the very same time? What if that very paradox is somehow, sometimes, a real aspect of the oddest moments of our lives? Here's a good example. A few summers ago, I was witness to an actual UFO sighting. I don't mean to say I saw a UFO. What I saw was two people next to me seeing something utterly astounding right above them that I was utterly unable to see. We were in Bristol down south in the UK way back in the last carefree summer before the pandemic. We were about 2 weeks into a European tour, me and Brett, with our bandmates Jason Toth and Alex McMahon, along with our support act Morgan Gear, who plays his Drunken Prayer. It was that wonderful time after a good show when everything's packed and there's nothing left to do but just feel grateful and wait for your tour manager to drive you to your hotel. And the night was perfect. A slight breeze was drifting in from the sea, and puffy clouds were slowly being pulled across the moonlit sky. So we were in no rush to leave the parking lot. The three of us were just leaning up against the van, staring up at that beautiful sky. Me and Alex and Morgan, all of us tired and peaceful, just staring up at the beauty of the clouds, wordless. And then suddenly the guy started screaming and pointing. Whoa, did you see that? Holy shit. Alex's head was shaking back and forth like he was trying to shake away something that couldn't be shaken away. Morgan was wild-eyed and staring. They were both talking at once, pointing and screaming, and I kept looking and looking where they were pointing, and I saw nothing. Nothing beyond the vague beam of a nightclub's circling spotlight reflecting off the clouds. And I kept saying, "You mean the beam from the dance club, right?" I kept saying it, and they kept shaking their heads. No, no, no. In fact, I'm not even sure that either of them saw a circling nightclub beam. It actually seemed like we were looking at two different skies completely. Even 2 years later, when I asked them about what they saw, neither of them can find words to express the full extent of what happened. They described a moving tableau of colored lights and several flying machines of unbelievable power and maneuverability. The crafts were weaving in and around each other in incredible complexity and speed. The two of them saw this in only seconds. But what they saw changed them both forever. It actually happens a lot, or so the internet will attest. A group of people see something utterly extraordinary, while others right next to them see not a thing beyond what's every day. The really weird thing is this. Sometimes, when one person sees a UFO flying past, another person reports seeing an owl. Mike Cleland's enormous book on this and so many more otherworldly owl encounters is called The Messengers. The book compiles everything from ancient lore to current blogs in a compendium so vast and compelling, it's hard to question the fact that humans have been seeing owls involved in all kinds of eerie and odd things for a very long time. Are we imagining all of this? Are owls the gatekeepers at the edge of reality, the consort of dark goddesses, the watchers at the edge of invisible worlds? Or are they just birds doing their best to catch mice in a world overpopulated by delusional humans, still afraid of all manner of shadows in the dark? Just so happens that Andy Washington, who was our tour manager on that very tour when Alex and Morgan saw the UFOs, well, Andy not only does not believe in UFOs, but he actually had a pet owl when he was a kid, and he will assure me again and again there was nothing weird about it. Andy named his owl William, and the bird sat on his shoulder while they watched after-school TV. I've seen pictures of it, and they are adorable. But when I ask Andy, "Do you think William was in touch with unseen dimensions?" Andy answers firmly, "No, because there are no such things as unseen dimensions." And that's probably actually the answer you want from a tour manager, especially one hired specifically to mine a bunch of musicians prone to spotting life-changing tableaus in the empty air above them. A strange incident occurred a few days before we saw the owl, and it was so strange, I felt no urge to tell anyone about it. I don't even want to tell you now because I know you won't believe me. I know it's just too weird. And the only reason I'm bringing it up now is because I have the odd conviction that this weird thing was the thing that brought the owl to our yard. I'll start by saying the desert air is strange. In Albuquerque in the summer, we often get storms with everything but rain. Wind howls, black clouds roll over, thunder and lightning, and then it all dies away without a single drop of water hitting the earth. It was just such a dry storm whipping up around us early last summer when we came out onto the back porch to watch. The trees were dancing back and forth and lightning flashed between groans of thunder. The air had a green tinge and felt heavy with moisture, even though there was no rain. And lightning began to strike in great zigzags across the horizon, and boom! There was a huge explosion over my neighbor's roof. The entire roof was clouded in smoke and the noise was deafening. I grabbed for my cell phone, assuming the house next door would be ablaze, but then I watched as the smoke dispersed, and there was no fire, no singe marks, nothing. The roof was perfectly fine. And then 30 seconds later, as we were still staring at the dispersing smoke over the house next door, it happened again. But this time the explosion was in our yard, about 20 feet from us, right in the empty air before us. A spark, boom, burst into appearance with a huge bang. A white point of light, just burning in the sky, directly in front of us. The spark spread out horizontally with a loud sizzle. Two perfect lines cutting straight out in opposing rays, sizzling away from each other, simultaneously, perfectly in sync. The lines, though, they burned slowly, far slower than any kind of lightning I'd ever seen flash. What it actually looked like was an old TV turning on. You'd pull the knob and a spark flashed at the center of the dark glass, and then the light would spread out to both sides before the entire picture jumped up into view. We watched our lines slowly crackle out about 10 feet in both directions, and it took about 5 seconds, and then boom! With a huge cloud of smoke, the whole thing exploded, and then it was gone. Weird lightning, Brett said, and all I could do was nod in agreement. What else was there to say? Maybe we saw a glitch in the matrix, or a doorway opening into another dimension. Maybe it was just weird lightning. It's the kind of thing people call ball lightning, which seems to be a term used to cover anything weird in the sky. It was some weeks after our altercation at the bird seed bin that I again spotted Limpy the raccoon. It was about 3 a.m., and I was out back watching for owls and drinking bad wine from an old jelly jar when something in the gloom made me look up. It wasn't an owl. It was just the familiar lopsided shadow of Limpy coming out of the side yard to the back lawn. But this time Limpy was followed by smaller shadows. Limpy had a family. She stopped short beneath the ash tree and gazed up in horror. The tree's branches reach over to the telephone pole and beyond and make a quick road to the alley for the local raccoons. And I've watched countless groups of them race up and down that tree. But this night, Limpy would move no further. Slowly, slowly, she backed away into the shadows. It was the rope swing, I realized. The swing I'd hung to watch for owls and then never bothered to use. Limpy was staring up at that canvas monster hanging across her pathway. In utter disbelief and utter horror, she looked like she was seeing a UFO. I hadn't, in my owl obsessions, considered the raccoon's point of view, or the trees for that matter, or the owls, or even the rope swings. Just how many points of view are there in your average yard? Dr. Schrodinger was definite in his answer. The total number of minds in the entire universe, according to Erwin Schrodinger, was one. Schrodinger believed that consciousness was a singularity that passed within life forms, but belonged to none, or rather it belonged to all things in equal measure, as needed. The cat in Schrodinger's box isn't alive or dead until we see it, but we also must await the cat's eyes upon us to be given life or death in the cat's universe. I watched Limpy lead her little brood back from the ash tree, slowly over into the far darkness at the other end of the fence, where a Japanese pine grows slanted and a bunch of pyracantha make a thorny bridge. This was a far more challenging climb for the babies, up through sharp needles and thorns, and then a walk along the very edge of our fence post to reach the telephone pole down to the alley. But that's exactly what Limpy made her family do, rather than risk the horrors of that strange swing hanging in her path. There was much crackling and the sound of little raccoons sliding and falling and crying out and climbing again until finally all four of them made it over to where Limpy was waiting, and then she led them at last down to the alley and away to their lives outside my yard. And they were gone then, the raccoons, from my world, and I from theirs. All of us little Shivas, destroying universes with the blink of an eye and creating new ones with the cast of a gaze. There's a strange optimism in all of our little points of view, perhaps all of us propelled onward just to see what comes next and next and next and next. Even the skunk that lives under our porch appears quite cheerful in her existence. She exudes a skunky joy in her jaunty forays across the yard after the sprinklers bring up the bugs from the soil. It's manna from heaven, I imagine, for the little skunk, gifts from the great skunk god. And she is single-minded in her happy pursuit of dinner, so much so that she is completely indifferent to her audience of humans and cats and raccoons. All of us paused in our night to keep our eyes on that dangerous tail. The raccoons, especially the new ones, sometimes they challenge the little skunks right to our yard, but they quickly learn the consequences of such folly. Our white cat, General Custard, he learned the hard way about what little skunks are capable of. I was alerted to his agony by wild thrashing noises coming from the laundry room in the middle of the night, and I found the cat with his head in the litter box, trying to get something terrible off his face by rubbing it in a box of his very own filth. But his eyes were swollen shut, and his nose and mouth were so inflamed he was awash in an oozing flow of saliva and snot. It was not easy to get him clean, or the house, but in the end, we all survived, and we all got a little wiser for it. You'd think Custard would now give the little skunk the same wide berth the raccoons give her, but instead he appears to be fascinated. He follows the skunk around the night yard, keeping well back, but compelled nonetheless to follow her. He looks like he's trying to figure out just how this strange, non-cat cat almost killed him with a swish of her tail. He'll have to come up with a story. And his story will be different than the story told by the skunk, or the story told by me, or the story told by the tree, or the story told by the owl. One afternoon last winter, I noticed Brett dabbling with a set of watercolors. "It's inspired by the owl," he told me as I looked over his shoulder at his work. "You remember the owl? The owl we saw up on the pole in the yard." "Pole?" I asked. "What pole?" "The owl we saw was perched on an electrical wire over the yard. We were looking straight up at it. There's no pole in the backyard." Brett looked at me with exasperation and put down his brush, and then we went out back to settle it. I watched Brett walking around in circles, staring up at the branches for a good while. Finally, he spotted something, and he pointed. There's the pole." He was pointing to the telephone pole in the alley, right behind our property. "The owl was in our yard," I said. "It was here." I pointed up to the wire above where I was standing. Brett looked at the wire, and he looked back at the pole, and he turned a few circles, and then he shook his head. I guess I just don't remember it that way. And then something caught his eye beyond the fence. "Wow," he cried. "Would you look at that?" He was pointing to a space between houses off to the south of our yard. I had no idea what he was pointing at. The house over there, it's gone. They must have torn the house down." "What house?" I said. That's the end of part 2 of The Owl. I don't know how long it will take me to finish part 3, but I will, and I hope you'll join me when it's done so that we can dive deeper into the shadows that surround The Owl.